Rain lashed down, wind howled through the trees, lightning split the sky, momentarily illuminating the figure of a lone man battling the elements. He was soaked to the bone, his clothes clinging to him like a second skin. Each gust of wind threatened to knock him off his feet. He had been traveling for hours, seeking shelter from the sudden storm. The road stretched endlessly before him, dark and treacherous. His heart pounded in his chest, a drumbeat against the symphony of the storm. He stumbled onward, driven by desperation and a sliver of hope. He had to find shelter. He had to get out of this storm. Suddenly, a faint light flickered in the distance. It appeared through the curtain of rain, like a beacon of hope. With renewed determination, he surged forward, his eyes fixed on the light. As he drew closer, the outline of a structure emerged from the darkness. It was a house, old and imposing, silhouetted against the raging storm. Relief washed over him, shelter at last. He approached cautiously, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He hesitated, a sense of unease washing over him. The house loomed over him, its windows dark and lifeless. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door. Silence. He knocked again, harder. The sound echoed through the house. He tried the doorknob. It turned easily in his hand. The door creaked open. He stepped inside, heart pounding. The air was heavy with dust and decay. He closed the door, shutting out the storm. He stood there listening to his own breathing. A sense of unease settled over him. He fumbled for his lighter, the flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the walls. He was in a large, dusty living room. Furniture lay draped in white sheets, giving the room a spectral appearance. A fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and empty. His eyes fell on a small table in the corner. A book lay open, as if someone had just been reading it. He approached cautiously, his curiosity piqued. It was a diary, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. He picked it up gently, careful not to damage the fragile pages. The first entry was dated several decades ago. He began to read, his eyes scanning the faded ink. The words painted a picture of a family who once lived in the house. Their hopes, their dreams, their fears. The diary's author, a woman named Amelia, wrote of strange occurrences, odd noises, and fleeting shadows. Her words were filled with a growing sense of dread, a feeling that something was amiss in the house. He shivered, a cold feeling creeping up his spine. He put down the diary, his mind racing. Was Amelia's diary a work of fiction, or had she truly experienced something sinister in the house? He glanced around the room, his senses on high alert. The shadows seemed to have deepened, twisting and contorting in the flickering light of his lighter. A sudden noise made him jump. It was a soft thud, coming from upstairs. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. He listened intently, but the sound was not repeated. He told himself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal that had found its way into the house. He tried to ignore the feeling of unease that was growing in the pit of his stomach. He was being foolish, he told himself. There was a logical explanation for everything. He just needed to stay calm and rational. He picked up the diary again, his eyes drawn back to its pages. He had to know more. What had happened to Amelia and her family? Was there something truly sinister lurking in the shadows of this house? He turned the brittle pages of the diary, each entry adding another layer of unease to his growing disquiet. Amelia's entries became increasingly frantic. She wrote of cold spots, disembodied whispers, and a feeling of being watched. Her once happy family was being torn apart by something unseen, something sinister that haunted the house. One entry in particular sent chills down his spine. Amelia described a horrifying figure, tall and skeletal, with eyes that glowed like hot coals. She called it the Shadow, an entity that fed on the fear and despair of the living. She believed it was responsible for the horrors that plagued their family. He slammed the diary shut, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't read anymore. Amelia's words were too real, too terrifying. He felt a presence in the room with him, something cold and malevolent. He was not alone. He had to leave. He had to get out of the house. He stumbled to his feet, his eyes darting around the darkened room. But as he turned towards the door, he noticed something strange. The door was gone. Panic surged through him. He ran to where the door had been, his hands frantically feeling the wall, but there was nothing there, just smooth, solid wall. He was trapped. He spun around, his eyes searching the room for another way out. The windows were boarded shut. The fireplace was too small to climb through. He was sealed inside the house, just like Amelia and her family before him. He could feel the presence growing stronger, feeding on his fear. It was in the shadows, watching him, waiting for him to break. He sank to the floor, his back against the wall, his eyes darting around the room. He was alone, trapped with something evil. The storm raged outside, mocking his plight with its fury. He was a prisoner in a haunted house, and there was no escape. He thought of Amelia's diary, her words echoing in his mind. The shadow, the entity that haunted the house, was it real? Was it responsible for his predicament? He didn't know what to believe anymore. He saw it then, a flicker of movement out of the corner of his eye. A tall, gaunt figure shrouded in darkness, standing at the edge of the light cast by the fireplace. Its eyes, two burning embers, locked onto his. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. This was no trick of the light, no figment of his imagination. This was real. Terror, raw and primal, seized him. He scrambled back, his eyes wide with fear. The figure took a step towards him, its skeletal hand reaching out. He could feel an icy cold emanating from the creature, seeping into his bones. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure moved closer, its burning gaze never leaving his. He closed his eyes, his mind reeling, bracing for the inevitable. He felt a cold, clammy hand grip his arm. He opened his eyes in horror. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the skeletal face of the shadow, a triumphant grin etched upon its lifeless features. He was gone, another victim claimed by the house and its sinister resident. Section 8, a glimmer of hope, extinguished. The storm outside raged on, oblivious to the horror that had transpired within the walls of the old house. Rain continued to lash down, the wind howling like a banshee, but inside an eerie silence descended. The struggle was over. The diary lay open on the floor, its pages fluttering gently in a sudden draft. Amelia's final entry, scrawled in a shaky hand, seemed to stare up from the page. "He is coming for me," it read. "The shadow is coming. I can't escape." Her words were a chilling reminder of the fate that awaited all who dared to enter the house. Days turned into nights. The storm subsided, leaving behind an eerie calm. The house stood silent, its windows dark and lifeless, but something had changed. There was a new presence within its walls, a new shadow lurking in the darkness. He was trapped, bound to the house just like Amelia and her family before him. He was doomed to repeat the cycle, his spirit forever entwined with the malevolent entity that haunted the house. Section 9. Resignation. He wandered the halls, a spectral figure trapped within the confines of the old house. He was no longer the terrified traveler seeking shelter. He was something else now, something less than human, consumed by the darkness that permeated the very walls of the house. He could still remember his life before, but the memories were fading, replaced by a growing sense of emptiness. He was tethered to the house, bound to it by a force he couldn't comprehend. He had become part of the haunting, another lost soul in the house's grim history. He was the new shadow, the embodiment of fear that would lure unsuspecting travelers to their doom. The storm had passed, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. Trees lay uprooted, their branches stripped bare. Debris littered the road, making passage difficult. A lone figure stumbled through the wreckage, his clothes torn and muddied. He was exhausted, hungry, and desperate for shelter. He had been caught in the storm while traveling to a nearby town. He had been lost for hours. His sense of direction gone, he just wanted to find somewhere safe, somewhere to rest and recover. As he rounded a bend in the road, he saw it. A house, old and imposing, stood at the top of a hill. A light flickered in one of the windows, a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. Relief washed over him. He had found shelter. He didn't notice the dilapidated state of the house, the overgrown lawn, the boarded-up windows. He didn't see the warning signs, the subtle clues that whispered of danger. All he saw was a chance to escape the elements, to find safety from the storm. The haunting continues. He approached cautiously, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He hesitated, a sense of unease washing over him. The house loomed over him, its windows dark and lifeless. It seemed to be watching him, judging his every move. He took a deep breath and knocked. Silence. He knocked again, louder this time. He waited, but there was no answer. He tried the doorknob. To his surprise, it turned easily in his hand. The door creaked open, as if inviting him inside. He stepped inside, unaware of the horrors that awaited him. The cycle had begun anew.